Hello, today I'll be presenting on the impact of cognitive emotion regulation levels on perceived stress in college students. So, the connection between stress levels and health has become well defined in recent years as researchers close the gap between understanding how stress can affect us physically and contribute to the development of long term chronic disease as well as other health issues. Because of this, there has now been an increased interest in stress itself and figuring out how we can decrease the negative effects of stress. In this project, I focus on stress in college students, a population that has historically been known to experience high levels of stress, as shown in this graphic, and are also a high risk population for adverse health outcomes related to stress, such as depression and anxiety. In particular, my project focuses on determining how different cognitive emotion regulation skills and thought processes can lead individuals to perceive stress differently than others, in hopes of closing the understanding gap in why some individuals experience stress differently, and also how we can potentially help those who have higher levels of perceived stress. So, like I said, through this project, firstly, I hope to determine if there's an association between stressors and perceived stress, and then I also hope to determine if there's a variable that moderates this association, specifically a cognitive emotion regulation practice or skill. The population we followed was incoming college students at UCLA, specifically 92 participants who completed daily surveys and questionnaires beginning 6 days before they moved in and continuing for 22 days after that. So basically, for their first month as college students. For this project, I specifically looked at entries which involved the perceived stress scale, which quantified levels of perceived stress, and strain, or the adolescent strain and adversity inventory, which tracked the amount of stressful events they were dealing with and which was the predictor of perceived stress. Finally, I used the Cognitive Emotion Regulation Questionnaire to determine, or the CIRC, to determine if there were cognitive moderators for this association, which gives a variety of scores for different emotion regulation skills. Using hierarchical linear models and mixed linear models, I did a statistical analysis to analyze individual participant results and scores. This gave several statistically significant results. Firstly, it did show that the association between stressors and perceived stress is significant. And then it also did indicate that there were several cognitive emotion regulation skills that were significant moderators of this association. So the first subscale I explored was self-blame, which has to do with the thought process of how often individuals believe they were to blame for the stressful situations they were in. On the left, we can see that self-blame um, significantly, um, in the left graph, we can see how strain significantly predicted perceived stress at all levels of self-blame. Furthermore, the diagram on the right shows how self-blame scores amplified the positive association between strain and perceived stress, so therefore increase the perceived stress of individuals. As we can see, if you look at the solid blue line, that when self-blame increased, the levels of perceived stress compared to strain are much higher. So therefore, individuals who practice this self-blame thought process more often were more likely to have higher levels of perceived stress than those who did not. The next significant skill I looked at was positive reappraisal, which has to do with the thought process of how individuals see a difficult event as something to learn and grow from that doesn't define them and believe it has positive sides. Similar to self-blame, the strain significantly predicted perceived stress at all levels of positive reappraisal scores. And then on the right, we can see that positive reappraisal increase in positive reappraisal scores also amplified the association between strain and perceived stress, as we can see that when positive reappraisal increases by 1 unit from the mean, the levels of perceived stress compared to strain are also increased. This is a particularly interesting finding, as we would assume that those who engaged in positive reappraisal thought processes would perceive stress as lower, but this shows that that wasn't the case. The next subscale I looked at was perspective, And this has to do with the thought process of how individuals put the situation into perspective of how bad it really is compared to other circumstances. Interestingly, the left graph indicates how strain significantly predicted perceived stress only below perspective scores at a certain level, which tells us that perspective scores may only provide a significant effect up to a certain level, but after that, they don't have a significant impact. The second diagram shows how strong the buffering effect was in the positive association between strain and perceived stress, as when perspective scores increase by 1 unit from the mean, we actually see the solid line become lower than the other two lines, indicating that perceived stress was actually lower in these individuals who had higher levels of perspective scores. This indicates that the perspective thought process may provide a protective effect against stress, but only up to a certain level, and beyond that level, it doesn't have much of an effect, at least in this study. The next subscale I looked at was acceptance, which has to do with the thought process of how well individuals are able to move forward from a stressful situation and accept things for what they are. Similar to the perspective thought process, acceptance scores only provided a buffering effect up to a certain level, but they also did show and provide a protective effect for perceived stress levels, as we can see in the graph on the right. The next skill was that of planned refocusing, which is how individuals think about and plan what they can do to cope with the situation and handle it. Planned refocus scores only provided a buffering effect up to a certain level as well, and on the right we can see just how much of a protective effect they had on levels of perceived stress. The final significant subscale we measured was the catastrophizing subscale, which describes how individuals think that the situation they were in was really terrible and as bad as could possibly be. Interestingly, individuals who engaged in catastrophizing thought processes also showed a protective effect against perceived stress levels up to a certain point. Overall, these results indicate that several cognitive emotion regulation skills significantly moderate the association between stressors and perceived stress, and thus provide a viable option for helping individuals to deal with big transitions or stressful situations. Specifically, perspective, acceptance, planned refocus, and catastrophizing thought processes show potential for being protective factors for high levels of perceived stress. This provides important information on how we could potentially help to lower stress levels for individuals who are at high risk for stress by working on these cognitive emotion regulation skills. Some limitations of this study include that it only focuses on UCLA students, which may not be representative of the entire college student population. And then also, it doesn't consider cultural differences or sex differences, such as how individuals may simply be perceiving this big transition event differently due to being first generation college students um, rather than having family or a history of higher education in their family, or for those being out of state rather than in state students who are still close to home. Both these circumstances may have an impact on how these individuals are perceiving stress. However, this provides opportunities for further research in this field to help understand how these population differences in perceived stress may differ and if cognitive emotion regulation may still moderate this association in these circumstances. Finally, future directions may want to explore and test if applying an intervention that focuses on improving the circ skills that had a buffering effect on this association can truly decrease perceived stress for adolescents in these big transition phases. Thank you so much for listening.